All right. Good evening, everyone. I guess we'll get started. So thank you for joining us tonight for the 1516th lecture of the Royal Asiatic Society of Korea. I'm Matt Van Valkenburg, Secretary of RAS Korea, and on behalf of the officers and councils, I welcome you to our lecture. By way of reminder, lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of Royal Asiatic Society Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. And we also especially thank Ms. Lee Jung-uk, who has made the use of this space at Fast 5 possible. We are joined tonight by Frank Dax. Frank was born in Pennsylvania and has spent a decade in Seoul teaching and writing. He has been published by Gastronomica, Korea Journal, Sisyphus, and elsewhere. And last year, he saw the release of his first novel, Real Toads Imagine Gardens. And tonight, he will provide a survey of the history and scope of Western depictions of Korea in writing and compare it to that of neighboring countries, while also discussing the inspiration for his own creative writing on Korea. So after the lecture, there will be time for questions. Please welcome Frank Dax.
Yeah, thank you all for coming, especially rainy season, midsummer. I know it's 방학 for a lot of people, so thank you. Small is fairly intimate crowd. Feel free to stop me at any point, and if you didn't understand or if you want to take note of something. Thank you for the introduction. I have a very short resume, so I didn't give you much to work with. Mostly my time here has been spent teaching English. It's a noble profession, though. I'm reminded of Joyce. Joyce was an English teacher in Italy, and J.K. Rowling as well in Portugal before writing Harry Potter. I actually gave a talk 9 years ago on the hiking culture in Korea through the RASK. Was anyone there? Unlikely. About 9 years ago. Still looking for evidence that it actually happened. All right, so we'll get going. We have a lot to do. Outsiders inside. When I write, and in general, I like to be intertextual. So the title itself is also somewhat intertextual. Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. He's standing outside a window, imagining himself in it, but also out of it. And the book we'll come to later by the name's covered, but Griffiths came to Korea over 100 years ago, or approximately 100 years ago, wrote this, Korea Without and Within. So it's sort of the theme for the talk. Outsider, insider, foreign, native, home and abroad. You might say that Western literature starts and ends with a journey. The book is, or the tale is, the Odyssey from Homer. And the ending of modern literature might very well be Ulysses. Also a journey, not only mimicking the Odyssey, but actually a journey through Dublin in one day. Joyce taught us that you can have an adventurous, transformative journey even within a city. And his book might be one of the first really urban journeys. And it's also perhaps the pinnacle of Western lit. So starts and ends with the journey. Strangely, Joyce is always very careful in what he does. So perhaps he tried to make his map of Dublin, the journey of Leopold Bloom. Maybe he tried to make it mimic Odysseus's journey. There are a lot of uncanny similarities, right? Go up there. Why so much travel, or why is travel such a big part of humanity and literature? Part of it's the mystery. For a long time, our world was an enigmatic space. This was There's no way to move this, no?
You can if you want. If you just move the mouse.
Yeah, oh, okay. Well, this is the world according to Herodotus, one of the great historians. You're saying move the mouse here? Oh, drag? Wow.
Should fit there. So if you move it up a little bit, at least that should.
Ah, yeah, you're right.
It should take it away.
Yeah, let's see.
There, maybe that.
Yeah, we'll see. So that's 400 BC. Fast forward a little. Oh, I got to click again right here. Fast forward 1,500 years, and the world hasn't, the conception of the world hasn't really changed all that much. This is a Muslim geographer, a British king, King Roger II, hired him to make a map. It doesn't look all that different, I'd argue. So the world was a mysterious place, which lent itself to a lot of imagining, the imagination. Map makers, there's a common, somewhat apocryphal idea that map makers labeled unknown parts as with here be dragons. The fact is, they actually usually said here be lions. Hict, this is abundant, leones. Usually, if it was a mysterious, shrouded region, here be lions. The start of travel for leisure, you might call it leisure, adventure, might begin with this guy. If you don't know Ibn Battuta, probably the pre-modern world's most traveled man. Here's a map of his travels. Keep in mind, this is medieval era. Basically went everywhere, even up to Beijing. They say he covered, in his travels covered over 100,000 kilometers. To give you a sense of that, Marco Polo only did about 25,000 kilometers. So Battuta, 4 times the travel of Marco Polo. This guy, Thomas Coryat, he was an Elizabethan, engaged in satire, comedy. He wrote this. They say he was the first, he traveled on foot predominantly, also maybe the first European to travel on foot to India. And he wrote about his travels throughout Europe. He's credited with bringing the fork to England and not coining, but popularizing the word umbrella, both of which apparently were from Italy. He learned those in Italy. A few considerations before we proceed, anthropological considerations. These terms, insider, outsider, foreign, native, we'll try to unpack them a little since they're somewhat unstable. Who's a foreigner, or who's to say who's a foreigner, and who's a native. To do so, this book in this field of study will help us. Said's Orientalism. It was post-colonial studies. He didn't found the field, but he heavily expounded on Orientalism, essentially saying that travel is never very innocent. When you travel, you have ideologies. There's usually prejudices involved, negative views of who you're visiting, sexuality, sexualizing the country. Remember, typically men were the ones visiting the new places. So sexuality was a component, exoticizing the other, mystifying it, assuming particularly the Far East that they harbor an ancient wisdom. Those are all parts of the discourse, those attitudes. However, it happened in reverse too. The Far East tended to exoticize the white man. This is a collection of artwork about the exotic white man. So it's from the perspective of, say, Indians, Chinese, Korean, Japanese. How do they portray the white man? or woman. Here's a Japanese, I'm not sure if it's an etching, but Japanese depiction. Yeah, I think he's holding alcohol. Another one, 19th century Japanese print. So even the white man is portrayed as a little barbaric, hairy, troublesome, sometimes rightly. This is an African market with sculptures. You can see the white man here. He's got a camera even. And if perhaps you've experienced, if you've been to Africa, as a white person, you're often singled out, sometimes playfully, sometimes not so much. The most common catcall in Africa is a local name for a white person. So even just walking down the street, you might hear one of these terms, Zungu, Ferengi, depending on where you are. Now, what do they mean? The derivation is thought to be from the people who travel or the people who walk in circles. Why? Some claim this stems from the fact that early colonizers all looked the same to Africans. So Africans thought they were walking around in circles. Oh, they see the same person again and again. Humorous, but of course there's the darker side to the colonization. Another from the same article, the Nigerian word bature means man with no skin, making it clear why our appearance in remote villages can still lead to such consternation. We are ghoulish, ghostly figures like half-formed larval humans. Yovo is Benin, Togo. The kids there will often chant Yovo, Yovo, bonsoir. It's supposed to mean cunning dog, appropriate. In Congo, you have their word means the white man with the lantern. Why? Because during the slave trade, he would sneak into villages at night with a lantern looking for victims. So, of course, it's not always black and white. Identity is not always black and white. You could invoke Hegel, the dialectic. His idea is that the other is the only adequate mirror of the self. The subject can only see itself when seeing another self or self-consciousness. So you know who you are best when you're confronted with someone else. And likewise, they would say the same. James Baldwin, African-American, he says something very similar. Whatever white people do not know about Negroes reveals precisely and inexorably what they do not know about themselves. So self-knowledge is also dependent on knowledge of the other. Nice picture, painting from the Migration series, Jacob Lawrence, I believe. Segregation. So in other words, we're trying to move beyond categories in part to the extent that it's possible. I'm going to talk about a number of books, comps with my own. I'm going to give a brief history of the other foreigners, let's say, who have written about Korea, Japan, and China. Of course, sometimes you have to move beyond categories. Pearl S. Buck is an interesting example. Technically American. She won the Nobel Prize for the US. First American woman to win. However, she moved to China when she was only 4 months old. So her whole youth and upbringing and formative years were spent in China. She probably, if not for her skin, would have passed as Chinese. And most of her books deal with Asia. On the other hand, you have someone like Lisa C., more modern, often writes about either China. This is a Korean book. She's American also. Her great-grandfather was Chinese. So are her depictions of Korea or China, or how are they to be viewed? Are they from a foreign perspective, or is she Chinese? Technically only 1/8 Chinese, but something to consider. Here's a contemporary writer, Paul Yoon, Korean-American, writes about Korea in English. How do you categorize? Are these depictions of Korea from a foreign perspective or from an insider perspective? I'd like to call on Maxine Hong Kingston, Chinese American, let's say. She tries to interrogate the idea of identity as well. Chinese American, she says. When you try to understand what things in you are Chinese, how do you separate what is peculiar to your childhood, to your family, to your mother, who marked your growing with stories, from what is Chinese? Meaning, how can you be sure that your experience growing up is not just singular or anecdotal? Or how do you know it's not a universal experience among Chinese Americans? Something to consider. And what is Chinese tradition and what is the movies? Kind of a problem now. When you think of America, you might think of cowboys. But is that really the reality for most of America? A lot of that comes from cinema. She's saying a lot of depictions of China, even your own self-identity, might be influenced by media. Anthropologists are integral to illuminating what is a culture and what is the identity of a place. One of the big ones is Clifford Geertz. He says humans live in webs of signification. However, the meaning of a cultural practice is often unknown even to those enacting it. What does that mean? Is people are performing a cultural habit don't always even know why they're doing it or that they're doing it. They take it for granted. Carrying a cell phone. Most people carry a cell phone. We don't think of it as a cultural thing so much. Just do it. Wearing jeans, let's say. Do you ask, why do we wear jeans and not skirts? Things like that. So questioning even local people, so it's possible that an anthropologist knows more in some ways about a culture than the locals, he's suggesting. A great essay, if you're interested in this, is Notes on the Balinese Cockfight. He spent a lot of time in Indonesia, studied the cockfight, popular pastime, all the symbolism around it, all the reasons they do it, motivations, psychoanalysis. Of course, if you ask one of these guys why you do it, they might just say, I want to get some money. I want to prove that my guy's better than his. Of course, a little later, a student of Geertz, Rabinow's a student of Geertz, he started questioning even the anthropologist. He says, well, observations are not independent of theory. So even the anthropologist trying to be neutral is still bringing ideas that he's not aware of. And the other problem with anthropology or ethnography is that the informants are also collaborators in the meaning you're trying to make, in the meaning you're trying to derive. Informants would be the people you ask about their culture. So if I ask a Korean, well, why do you do this? See, he's saying the Korean has to engage in self-reflection at that point, which already makes it let's say, a vested opinion. And it might be an opinion, they might be giving an opinion you want to hear, not necessarily the truth. And that's an unconscious process. In other words, both the ethnographer and the informer are engaged in meaning making together. Another thing he raises that's of interest is, he says any field worker, any traveler is going to encounter interruptions and eruptions. However, often meaning is derived from these experiences. They are turning points, he said. Meaning travel is often emotional, and I'll give you a few examples later, but travel can be emotional, not just an intellectual or moral exercise. But from those emotional points, you can take a lot. You can derive a lot, even if they're upsetting or difficult at the time. An example of this comes from Bohannon, the struggle of trying to meet an other on the same terms. This is another great essay, Shakespeare in the Bush. She visits a small village in West Africa. She's trying to tell a story by a campfire. They tell her, tell us a story from your culture. So she thinks of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. She says, that's a great tragedy. I'll explain Hamlet to them. So she explains Hamlet thinking tragedy, they'll understand, it's universal. They'll love this story. The fact is, a lot of her meaning was lost. They couldn't relate to certain things. For example, if you remember, Hamlet's father, the king, he dies, reappears as a ghost. These local Africans didn't have a notion of ghost or spirit walking around. So they didn't understand that. Well, how could he be walking around? How could he see a ghost? If you remember, Hamlet's mother remarries. That incites the whole plot. To this polygamous society, they were okay with remarriage. Well, why would Hamlet be mad that his mom remarried? That's okay. So meaning making is a difficult, thorny process. All right. Let's look at some of the early instances of writers who have written about the Far East. West goes east. You might recognize this is an inversion of the title East goes west. Young-hil Kang visiting the US. Korean guy wrote about his experiences visiting the US. Start off with China, go to Japan, and then Korea. Brief overview of Western depictions of these places. Why China and Japan and Korea? Well, as Percival Lau said, the three are in a link, the three are links in a chain, cultural chain. He says China borrowed a lot from India, Korea borrowed a lot from China, and Japan borrowed a lot from Korea. Japan being at the end of the link, according to him. And historically, as you dig, Japan did borrow a lot from Korea. Obviously, it reversed itself in many points. So China, we often think that this is Marco Polo. We often think he was the first Westerner to visit China. Far from the truth. He wasn't even the first person in his own family to visit China. His father and his uncle went to China before him. He was the second of the family. Why is he well remembered? Well, because he wrote a great account of it. And writing it's often the written history that becomes history. Even Columbus admired Marco Polo. Here's a copy of Columbus's, I guess it's a Latin edition. Yeah. These are Columbus's marginalia of Marco Polo. So, fellow travelers, the reality though is, let's see, the Roman presence and Greek presence in China dates back well earlier than Marco Polo. Many archaeologists have questioned the terracotta army. China never made big sculptures or statues before. These must have been influenced by the Greeks, right? Greeks are well known for their sculpture. So theory has it now that the Greeks were here even then, influencing Chinese arts. Here's a famous tapestry. Anyone see anything Western about it? It's from the 3rd century BC. Well, this guy has blue eyes. So it's made in China, Sampu. This guy has blue eyes, though, meaning they must have had contact with Westerners. And here's a centaur, a Greek mythical being. The man on the half man, half horse, or goat, horse. So signs of early contact. Trade routes in 870. By 870, still 400 years before Marco Polo, you had trade everywhere. And in fact, here are the main Silk Road, the spice roads. These trades were very important. In fact, when they were ruptured, when the routes were ruptured by various empires, usually something resulted. In one case, the Crusades. And in another case, the Age of Exploration or Age of Discovery. Once the Silk Road was blocked by I believe it was the Ottoman Empire, one of the Middle Eastern empires blocked the Silk Road, so forcing the, let's say, Westerners to search for alternate routes to get spices. So very important. Around the same time as Marco Polo, people estimate there were thousands of Europeans living in China, perhaps not far eastern China, but in China. Rome even had what they called, let's say, embassies in 300 BC. The Pax Mongolia was a period of relative stability and peace in this region. Foreigners were welcome, not many, but many merchants, and then the ambassadors. I forgot, Emperor Justinian in the year about 500 AD, 500 AD, he even sent people to steal silkworms from China. He wanted to make his own silk. So Marco Polo, far from the first. You later had this guy, John de Manville, set forth then, wrote about it. 1881, another Henry Shore. We won't dwell on these. Arthur Smith, his book apparently was very widely read, and even the Chinese considered it a good depiction of themselves. So if you're interested in early Chinese depictions, they say he was quite good at it, usually comic. He went over as a newspaper reporter for the Shanghai newspaper and wrote some comic essays. You had a soldier in Peking, Beijing, writing about his experiences. I'm going to move that again. Let's try it there. Peking Dust. She says, this book is compounded of gossip, the flying gossip or dust of Peking. Take it lightly, blow off such dust as may happen to stick to you. For authentic information, turn to heavy volumes written by more acknowledged students. So she's being playful. 1922, you guys, Somerset Maugham, big name, described a lot of characters in China at the time. Came out with another book, Painted Veil, also dealing with China. Actually earlier, yep, here we have a poet, Eunice Tipton, also wrote some stories. Female, one of the, let's say, early females to visit. Here's Pearl F. Buck receiving the Nobel Prize. We mentioned her. A novel, first paperback ever published, not sure. Military novel. Oil for the Lamps of China. This was a businessman who went to China to try to sell oil lamps. And in fact, the title became a catchphrase at the time for American, or let's say Western businessman trying to open markets there and trying to exploit the market, become successful financially. There's also sort of a symbolic, he was critical of this, by the way, or perhaps his name was Alice, but man, yeah, he was critical. Or the light, the idea of light, the West bringing light to the East. You can see the Orientalism, assuming that the West knows better than China. So he was critical of these enterprises. Here's another businessman, an advertiser. He went, wrote a book about his experiences there. The book is called 400 Million Customers. And apparently, it was an accurate depiction, even more accurate than Buck's peasants. She tended to portray the peasants, Pearl S. Buck, and Edgar Snow portrayed the revolutionary. So people like this. There's Pearl, another one. Going forward in time, Clavel, Ballard. There's a lot. We won't dwell on all of these. Journeys into the Yangtze. These are more modern depictions. Here's another English teacher like myself. He went there and wrote about the interior. Oh, we've been waiting a long time for a novel that captures the foreign teacher in China experience. Quincy Carroll's written it. Here's a less serious one, perhaps. An epic 5-year adventures that would find him homeless, stateless, posing as professor in prison, deported. An American bum. And finally, another kaleidoscopic portrait of, so let's continue. We'll talk about Japan. One of the, not the very first, but one of the very first was Xavier, St. Francis Xavier. He was in Japan, missionary. By the way, yeah, an old print of him, perhaps over there. This was a German naturalist, went there, wrote a book. For about 200 years, his book was the main source of Western knowledge of Japan. When Japan finally opened its, let's say, opened its ports, which was 1853, you had a lot of sudden interest in Japan. The French coined the word Japonisme, which was a trend among artists in Europe. Gauguin, Monet, Manet, Cavett. They fell in love with the Japanese aesthetic, and they adopted it and tried to use it in their own art. Here's an example, Monet. Even Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, he went to Japan, designed an imperial hotel, wrote a book about the Japanese print. If you like his homes and you tour his homes, you'll notice a number of Japanese elements, prints, etc. He liked the floor heating system too, which he didn't realize Korea did and maybe did better. He wanted to adopt it in the US, but didn't find it practical here or there. Moving forward, here's a prolific traveler, Isabella Bird. Not only visited Japan, but we'll see her later. She went to Korea. Unbeaten tracks. So popular that there's a modern manhwa comic about her, Isabella Bird, in Wonderland. Never read it. Moving forward, we have this guy, Henry Craven St. John. His job, he was stationed off of Taiwan. He was stationed in the Far East off of Taiwan. His job was to sort of protect coast from pirates, but ended up visiting Japan, sketching it. Now, Percival Lau, he's a big name. He'll come up again with Korea. A fun guy. Perhaps out of all the old writers I researched, he might be the one most engaging today. So, for example, travel, he says, is like life. It's good to have a companion. Divides the troubles, doubles the joys. Wrote another book, Soul of the Far East. He was fairly laudatory about Japan and the Far East in general. He says, it must be a great civilization if ordinary tea house girls are the models of refinement and common coolies, coolies was the old word for laborers, blue-collar workers. When they were not at work, they played chess. Maybe Chinese chess or Baduk, who knows. So he loved them. Wrote another book called Noto, about going to a small town called Noto. He had a pure love of travel. Why did he go there? Simply because it looked cool on the map. You can read that. He liked the sound of the word. He liked where it was situated. So he basically just pointed. He was in Japan at the time and said, oh, I think I'll go there. Went there, wrote a book about it. Wow, again. Lafcadio Hearn, he became quite well known if you're interested in Japanese studies. Translated a lot of their folk tales and their, let's say, their eerie ghost stories. Also a teacher for a bit. Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan from 1894. You can see a little bit of Orientalism here. Elfish everything seems in Japan. For everything as well as everybody is small and queer and mysterious. The illusion is only broken by the occasional passing of a tall foreigner and by diverse shop signs bearing announcements in absurd attempts at English. So that hasn't changed much, actually. You still find a lot of malaprops in Japanese use of English. But yeah, Hearn, we read it differently now than we say would have then. This guy is also very fascinating. He wrote letters home to his parents while traveling in these countries. He was sort of let's say, an early backpacker. He went with 4 college friends from Yale. It's hard to imagine the backpacking culture at that time, but he was an early practitioner of it. 22 years old, did all these travels, wrote letters home. Pearl S. Buck, here's one of her books on Japan. Satire of trying to civilize Okinawa, post-war. Donald Keene, big name in Japanese studies. Notice the date, 1959. He wrote another book in 2008. So that's a 5-decade career of Japanese studies. Chronicles of My Life, an American in the Heart of Japan. James Bond, if you like James Bond, Ian Fleming was pretty well traveled. He set one of his books there. Shogun, now a popular TV series based on the book. If you like sci-fi, Neuromancer, that was set in Japan, Tokyo. One of the common themes or recurring themes you see with foreign depictions of the East is this idea of mystery, trying to arrive at the heart of something that didn't exist where no one had gone before. So looking for the lost, for example. Wiley will mention again the book he did on Korea, Japan Chronicles, Japanese Chronicles. The Lady and the Monk, Pico Iyer, great journalist, married to a Japanese woman, wrote a lot about it. Learning to bow, a nice idea, you know, from your very birth, you're inculcated in certain habits. Tokyo Sketches. Other Donald Ricci, pretty prolific in Japanese studies. More modern one. Memoirs of a Geisha, turned into a well-known movie. Again, Donald Ricci, Tokyo, A View of the City. So these are books that I sort of had in mind when I was writing other sketches, other depictions of places. Traveler's Tales. This is a compilation. Various artists. Pico Iyer again. Uhaku. Tales told over beers in a pub. Stories of corporate drudgery. Doodlings on napkins at local Starbucks and professional pieces produced on deadline. Yeah, I was interested in similarly capturing the broad spectrum of life in a place. This accomplishes that. Neon Pilgrim. Thousand Autumns, keep going. The only gaijin in the village, a guy who moves to rural Japan, is the only foreigner in the area. Inaka, Portraits of Rural Life, by a collection of authors. Keep going. Another teacher, escaping Minnesota. So again, lost Japan, hidden Japan, that same concept. Alex Kerr, also notable. Tokyo Junkie, keep going. Mountain Madness. Found and Lost in the Peaks of America and Japan. Similar idea. The Magic of Japan. Garcia is well known nowadays. Kyoto Stories, keep going. So here's a foreigner that maybe you guys can relate. Once she felt she was fully assimilated, she said, now no one is ever too nervous to sit next to me on the train. I rarely receive the English menu. When I walk into a restaurant in rural Japan, the whole place will never fall silent. All right, let's continue. Korea, often called the Hermit Kingdom, similar to Japan for a while, very closed borders. They felt if they were too open, they would be open to aggression, invasion. And we'll get into this in a bit. Yeah. So actually, if you happen to end up in Korea for a long time, you weren't allowed to leave. The most famous instance was Hendrik Hamel. Hamel was shipwrecked there with about 30 other Dutchmen. They wouldn't let him leave. He was prisoner. They didn't want him. So he stayed there. Korea also had a small conception of the world at the time. He says the Koreans believe there are but 12 kingdoms or countries in the whole world. We named some countries to them. They laughed at us. You imagine, oh, we're from the Netherlands or England or you name it. The Koreans would laugh. Ah, that's no country. That doesn't exist. Ironically, 30 years before Hamel, another Dutchman was shipwrecked there. He had to stay 30 years. He stayed so long that Hamel, when he met him in Korea, said that he basically forgot his native tongue. So he basically forgot Dutch. However, that guy's Roosevelt was his name. He came in 1627. Before I show you that, Hamel's very famous. There's a replica of his ship in Jeju-do. Eventually, he was allowed to leave and wrote a book about it. There's even a museum about him. So again, he wasn't the first Westerner, nor even the first Dutchman, but he wrote well about it, spread news of Korea. Once he left, once he was able to negotiate a departure, and became well known. Here's one of his observations, which is still relevant today. He says, the nobility and all free men in general take great care of the education of their children and put them very young to learn to read and write, to which that nation is much addicted. So he's noting that Koreans are very studious. This was more than 300, 400 years ago. Picture of the examination grounds. We'd say not much has changed there. Continuing, MacLeod was a surgeon on a ship, wrote about it. Basil Hall. This book remained popular for a long time as a source of knowledge. Grinnell, Walton Grinnell. Again, he's saying Koreans are quite intelligent. Even the poor people know how to read and write. If you recognize the name Grinnell, his father, the Grinnell expedition was to find John Franklin, who was trying to find the Northwest Passage. They died and disappeared. His father financed the expedition to try to find those bodies. Griffiths mentioned him. He coined, I don't know if he coined, but he popularized Hermit Nation, Korean fairy tales, and then again, Korea within, or without and within. One of his quotes, Korea stands in much the same relation to the traveler that the region of the pole, North or South Pole, does to the explorer, and menaces with the same penalty of the too inquisitive tourist who ventures to penetrate its inhospitable borders. So he's calling attention to the fact that if you went to Korea, you probably weren't leaving, at least for a while, or you faced some danger. Why should Korea be sealed and mysterious when Japan, once a hermit, had opened her doors and come out into the world's marketplace? There's a capitalist motive in a lot of this, which eventually pressured Korea to open her doors. Remember, Orientalism, exploration is often allied with capital, science, but also conquest. It's a point that if you're a fan of Sapiens, Yuval Harari's book, he emphasizes. Exploration is never innocent. And eventually, there was a lot of inner feud. Should we open? Should we not open? You saw an uprising, the peasant revolution in the 1890s. This guy led the peasants. They rejected Western values. They were Neo-Confucian in stance. Eventually, they lost. And I believe in this year, the Kanghwa Agreement was signed, opening Korea. And that kind of snowballed into eventually Japan running Korea. Here's Percival Lowell again. He might be more famous as an astronomer. He was the first person to observe what he's called canals on Mars. That idea influenced a lot of science fiction writers. H.G. Wells, for example, Ray Bradbury, because they thought, oh, there could have been water on Mars, which means there could have been life, Martians. So it sort of opened the imagination. Pluto is indirectly named after him, PL of Pluto, Percival Lau, as well as Pluto's abbreviated astronomical symbol. He's a great writer. Now that you and I, gentle reader, have journeyed so many thousand miles in company, we should surely have learned to know each other, for nothing we both admit so reveals character as travel, except marriage. He loves travel. Seoul at that time didn't have the electric lighting in the streets, so it was very dark, unlike Paris or London or even Tokyo or Canton. He admired another fellow, Landor, admired the ondol, the heating situation, although this person did not admire it. He calls it barbaric. You can see the word barbarian a little strange to modern ears. And he thought that Seoul had nothing to offer. He might not have been too far off at the time. Seoul was fairly, in some sense, provincial. So he found nothing of interest there, fairly negative. And he said it smelled bad. Take strong salts with you if you're going to walk through the streets so you can hide the smell of the street. But this was also the same man who called the Ainu the hairy Ainu. He went to the northern island of Japan, wrote a book on them. Regale. He was one of the founders of the Royal Asiatic Society of Korea and a former president, 1915 president. Wrote Korean sketches. Here's Bishop again, the woman. She also shrinks from describing intramural Seoul, between the wall Seoul. I thought it the foulest city on earth until I saw Peking. However, she admits that Seoul is the center of everything. Every man who can pay for food and lodging on the road trudges to the capital once or twice a year. And people who live in it, of whatever degree, can hardly be bribed to leave it for a few weeks. It's the only place worth living. Homer Holbert, he was an English teacher briefly, also a missionary. Tried to write about all classes of people. Herbert, missionary. So the church was very influential as well in exploration. A lot of the first people to visit the Far East were missionaries, if not merchants. He was another one, Allen. One of his depictions of the country, he said that the peasants were permitted to cut off all trees and shrubbery from the hillsides facing the sea, thus giving the coastlands a dreary and cheerless appearance, not likely to tempt few passers. So according to him, they deliberately made the coast of Korea unappetizing for people to land and visit during the time when Korea was isolationist. He said the post mail was not well received by a lot of people. The mail was a sign of westernization. They rejected the post office and the mail. A mob destroyed one of the post offices. Continue. He talking about some of the provincialism. He had a bicycle and he met an old man. The old man said, well, I suppose this is the new thing called a railway, of which I have heard so much about. So the old man mistook, he heard the word railway. Oh, that must be it. As far as bicycles go, he said, Koreans are very polite. I accidentally knocked someone over when I was riding my bike, and that person apologized. They said, oh, sorry, even though they were the one knocked to the ground. The railway, remember, those in Japan, it was already ahead of the schedule. In Korea, slow going. But it wouldn't wait for anyone. So even the nobles had to learn, okay, the trains are timely. You had a lot of unfortunate incidents. Remember, you probably are aware the traditional pillow would be something hard and wood to keep the top knot of the hair from being mangled on the ground. So some people actually, they found, oh, this train track is a good place for my head when I sleep. The train's not going to come at the night. Fortunately, many were killed, according to him. because of trying to sleep on the tracks. Not sure how accurate that is. Continuing, Rut was another president of the Royal Society here. Undiplomatic memories. Diplomat, had a bad experience overall, more or less. Perles Buck, here's her Korean book, The Living Reed. Continue. Richard Rutt, Diary of a Country Priest, another religious visitor. He's borrowing the title from a French book, Diary of a Country Priest. Continue. This was published by the Royal Asiatic Society. The Middleton Husband and Wife, Korean Journeys, published by them. Inscrutable Oriental. Remember going back to the theme of the mysterious, inscrutable Oriental. Korean Patterns, Paul Crane. You continue, you got to pick up time. Winchester, he followed the Dutch route that the Dutch were walking in order to get to Seoul. He says the capital's lack of beauty does not inhibit its magnetism. If you have a horse, counsel is an old Korean saying, send it to Jeju. If you have a son, send them to Seoul. Maybe that's a proverb. Send your horses to Jeju, send your sons to Seoul. Sadly, Korean cities are now filled by men and women wearing Western dress. This is in 1988, but the word sadly here reveals those biases I talked about. Why is it sad that Koreans are not dressing in hanbok anymore? He wants to see a traditional side of Korea. Well, you can't always. Here's Wiley again, Festival for 3,000 Maidens. We'll keep going. We'll catch up. Some North Korean novels. This guy was a businessman in North Korea. Another kind of frenzied book, a guy who ends up in jail. These are a trilogy, sorry. Brother Anthony translated this one. The Nobel Prize winner, Clezio, he wrote a book about Korea also, Bitna, Under the Sky of Seoul. Apparently he really likes Seoul. Here's Lisa C. again. Another Korean Odyssey. All right, let's keep going. So now I'll just dive into my book real quick. A little late, but T.S. Eliot once said that a good writer borrows, a great writer steals. So when writing mine, I borrowed a lot. I'm going to quickly run through a few of the antecedents, the inspirations. First of all, my book is divided seasonally. The 24 traditional calendrical divisions, Jolgi. This was a famous book in Korea about the record of the seasonal customs, translated by, well, Warner Safs, also a fellow RASK member. If you know what Chekdek are, the farmers' almanacs, they were once popular. That sort of served as a model as well. Here are the solar terms. I hope you're familiar. 24. Each tends to have some traditional foods that are associated. Other books that are organized seasonally, Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinkle Creek, George Gissing's Private Papers, Sand County Almanac, another good one, organized seasonally. We'll skip historical columns. Other writers have used the vignette format, which I adopted. There's a Japanese genre called the zuihitsu, which means at will, pen. It means you can write about anything you want. Lists, little musings, anything on your mind. One of the most famous is the Pillow Book, Shei Sonigan, over 1,000 years old. A woman who had insider knowledge of the Japanese court. Essays in Idleness, another old book. And another one, An Account of My Hut. These are famous from that genre. Another one. More contemporary, Jean Toomer wrote Cain, an African-American novelist. Portrayals, this is a Spanish one. Juan Ramon Jimenez, short vignette, beautiful book. Speedboat, No Adler. Prairie Earth about Kansas, depictions of Kansas. This one's relatively unknown, Brazilian writer, posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas. Won't get into it too much. Rimbaud, Illuminations. All right, the flaneur. I kind of adopt the persona of a flaneur in the book. Walter Benjamin advanced this idea a lot, the flaneur, walking through the arcades of Paris. They tended to be covered, which means you can walk in all weather. The rain, snow. Rousseau wrote a book about walking, The Solitary Walker. Even Poe wrote a story about it, The Man in the Crowd. Rilke has his notebooks when he was living in Paris, wrote that. Dickens wrote Night Walks. Virginia Woolf wrote an essay called Street Haunting, about walking at night. Pessoa from Portugal, Inveterate Walker. Korean book, In the Day in the Life of Kubo, the novelist. Also, his day spent walking around Seoul. Joseph Mitchell, New York writer, continue. Alfred Kazan, Walker in the City, famous critic. More recently, Open City, Teju, New York, Walker. Continuing, place studies, portraits, polyphony. So these are studies of a specific place. You know, I was studying Seoul. Dickens did a focused study of London society. Turgenev wrote about some Russian village where his mom lived while he was hunting. Baudelaire's Paris Spleen, similar to Flowers of Evil, if you're aware. Dubliners, of course, Dubliners a big inspiration. I invoked it on the back. Edgar Lee Masters, Small Town, USA. Winesburg, Ohio, another small town depiction of Ohio. Dos Passos of New York, Jazz Age, quite good. This is of Madrid. This is of Wyoming in the US, also quite good. Vietnam, this was the Pulitzer winner. His depictions of Vietnam, recommended. All right, continuing. Haibun, Ekuye. Haibun was also an inspiration. The Haibun was a travel form, usually a short depiction of an experience traveling, and then a little haiku after. Basho, of course, famous book. Here with Basho's roots, not quite batutas, but kiyoe, if you're aware. Kiyoe is the wood block. They tended to depict many places in different aspects. Summer, winter, day, night. Many views of the same place, Mount View, Fuji. 53 stations, okay, we'll skip, don't have much time. 100 views of Edo, spring, summer. 100 aspects of the moon, another great series of etchings. So he's depicting the moon in various ways. This inspired me a lot. Different ways to view the moon. All right, finally, new journalism. You could call this new journalism in a way. Tom Wolfe, sort of the largest exponents. Joan Didion, Hunter Thompson. All right, let's get into the book real quick. Can I go, 10 more minutes? Is that too errant? It's 8:30? Or what, yeah, 8:30? Well, skip ahead. I was gonna, I don't know if you like the literary device of the found manuscript. I kind of hate talking about my own work in a sense. So I was gonna try to talk about it from a third-person perspective comically, but anyone know what the Red Book of Westmarch is? That's the framing tale of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Nabokov uses framing tale for Pale Fire as well. So Gissing did as well. Let's dive in a little bit. The title comes from a poem by Marianne Moore. She says that poets should try to present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads. We won't dwell on that. I think the preamble is worth reading. Preamble, the very first page, deliberately hyphenated, preamble, pre-walking. Again, the flaneur notion. I say, meet me at Stair Bottom in cherry dawn, and I'll walk you through a city and its seasons. Seasonal. Come, we'll stroll dirt lanes and gilt boulevards along unburied paths and upbudding futures. Yes, we'll drift and wander among the cliffs and canyons formed by high-rise buildings, those Pueblo dwellings of modern living. We'll greet bees and boulders and valleys of white clouds and red oaks and by cool streams that our thoughts to tongue poets turn. Come and we'll peer into gardens, unpack peaches on trains and divine dreams to doorways of warmly lit homes. Come, come, we'll gather chestnuts in gorges, examine moss flowers on mountains, seek plum trees in pine forests, and sit like herons on river rocks used by generations of washerwomen. Hurry now, from splendor to squalor, we'll adopt a love for all things, for bricks, weeds, and clay pots, handbags on hooks, crickets in corners, snow on rooftops. We'll glorify gutter glass, bond with alley cats, and beneath upturned stones find secret beauty. Come, comrade, whoever you are, grab your moth-eaten fleece, your shawl, your dhoti, your cloak or hakui, lace up your boots, pocket your fife, and carve out a staff of Hazel's finest. Come now, be quick, and slowly we'll see the cinema of light that ends in white stars and fields of black night. The reason I read it is because there's a lot of literary allusions here I'd like to draw attention to. First off, maybe you heard Whitman's voice. Whoever you are, come forth. A man or woman, come forth. This is Song of the Open Road, the poem. Alone, the road is before us. It's safe. I've tried it. My own feet have tried it. Be not detained. Camarado, I give you my hand. Will you give me yourself? Will you come travel with me? Shall we stick by each other as long as we live? So I try to invoke Whitman there. If you're familiar with Kerouac, Dean Moriarty, his companion in the books, he says, there goes Dean Moriarty, ragged in a moth-eaten overcoat he bought specially for the freezing temperatures of the East. So I had to throw in the moth-eaten fleece, shawl, dhoti. Dhoti is in the Indian dress. Hakui is a Japanese dress that the pilgrim tends to wear when they travel. Also, within this passage, I tend to introduce many of the themes and imagery that I will later get into in the novel. It's kind of it's a technique I borrowed from Joyce, the Dubliners. The very first paragraph of Dubliners begins, every night as I gazed up at the window, I said softly to myself the word paralysis. It had always sounded strangely in my ears like the word nomen in the Euclid and the word simile in the Catechism. What Joyce is doing is, these are emphasized purposefully. Nomen, simile, and paralysis become themes in Dubliners. So I like that idea. Speaking of borrowing, the one of the early vignettes is called ubi sunt. Ubi sunt is a Latin word expression for where are they now? Talks about how rapidly Korea is changing, or Seoul in particular. And you might visit a neighborhood that a year or two later won't even exist. We had a speaker, Matt Baker, is that his last name? He talked about exploring areas that are going to be demolished. So ubi sunt. Again, I deliberately invoke Joyce. Night after night, I passed their house, and night after night, I'm seeing it darkened. I hoped the old couple would soon return and might only be out of town. So I gave a footnote here. Following T.S. Eliot's lead in the wasteland, I'll give my own intertextual notations. Just for comparison, here's Joyce, the sisters. There was no hope for him this time. It was the third stroke. Night after night, I'd passed the house and studied the lighted square of window, and night after night I had found it lighted in the same way, faintly and evenly. So in the story, the sisters, a boy is looking up at the room. He realizes the window's dark. The man must have died. In my story, I realized the old couple, their house is dark. They must have moved away. The neighborhood is going to be evacuated. The neighborhood has been sentenced to renewal. Residents have 6 months to evacuate. So Wordsworth wrote a nice poem on the ubi sunt motif. We won't do that. Nostalgia, if you live abroad, nostalgia is a common emotion. It's also a common emotion for societies that are changing rapidly. Here's a nice metaphor for nostalgia. Miljenko Yurgovich says, nostalgia is like a yellow street dog following us around, retreating when we try to pet it. Perhaps you've experienced that. Street dog following you, but then when you go near it, it runs away. Nostalgia could be used like that. In this episode, I'm talking about the dock sellers, street vendors that they're hard to see nowadays, but occasionally you might see someone selling dock or some, let's say, some good on the street, hawking it. It kind of invokes a vestige of a former time while also trying to preserve that link to the past. You might say, given all these intertextuality, that I might experience what's called anxiety of influence. It's a concept that Harold Bloom put forward, that any writer has an anxiety from all the predecessors, all the people that wrote before him. And I agree in a way. And so I tried to write a short vignette. This is the entirety of it, about the challenge of trying to write an original haiku on the cherry blossoms. That's sort of a cliche topic, right? Cherry blossom haiku. How can you write an original haiku? Well, this sentiment is not very new. Basho himself experienced it. He said, I came all the way to see the moon, and then failing to write a worthy poem. So Basho, he went on a moon viewing tour, wanting to write some nice haiku about it. and he failed. I can't think of anything to say about the moon. But he found comfort in the fact that, say, Shonagen, the same woman who wrote the Pillow Book, also experienced the same sentiment. Remember, year 1000, she went on a cuckoo bird trip. They journeyed to hear the cuckoo. They considered it very beautiful. She wanted to be inspired. She also failed. So I'm trying to establish a link, somewhat presumptuously, but the modern writer, Basho, Sei Sonagan, it's a universal experience of writers. All right, we'll go 5 more minutes. If you've lived in Seoul, you know the fireworks festival every October is fairly big. Here I wrote a somewhat experimental piece on the fireworks festival. It ends in a lot of sounds, very Joycean. In fact, also Kerouacian. Kerouac might recognize this quote. He said, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, and burn, burn, burn like phallus, candles. Candlelight pop and goes, ah." You recognize that? Saying, befriend wild people. So some of my language will mirror that. Joyce also did in the Nausicaa chapter, a Roman candle. Oh, this is a sort of ecstatic moment. Oh, so lovely. Oh, so soft, sweet, soft. Then all melted away dewily in the air. All was silent. Okay. For time, we'll skip. I wrote a little bit about shamanism, the vestiges of it, in the form of, well, maybe you'd better read the book. Here's an interesting concept. Palace maiden with unpinned hair. I'm not sure if you know the term. So at one point, pinning your hair up was a sign of maturity. Women would bun it up, like so. Men as well, when you wore the top knot, you entered into, let's say, adolescent adulthood. So this vignette is about a girl going to the Myeongsil, the beauty salon, watching her mother getting her hair done. And as you know, Seoul streets are filled with the beauty salon. There could be a little bit of a cultural current running through this and the modern day beauty salon. Jungji, the wisdom of the masses. This is about eating pajeon on rainy days. I'm trying to understand why is pajeon popular on rainy days. This is about eating hongo, the fish. Here, this is about eating Chinese food in Seoul's Chinatown. I was a little experimental in this part. If you're familiar with the kenning is an old English literary device where you combine 2 nouns to signify a meaning. The Korean language and Chinese language lend themselves to this very well, right? You take 2 nouns, put them together, and you have a new, somewhat interesting noun. If you consider, for example, maybe pyudok, necessary reading, or yajong, the sentiments, the melancholy of travel. What is it? Zhonghua, a meaningful, intimate conversation, things like that. So I tried to, because I was sitting in Chinatown, a restaurant, I tried to use that in my writing. Of course, you ultimately fail, but I'm on a stale air bus, jammed like a bean sprout jar. Here, why don't I jump down? It's 7 hours post-noon when I table sit. That's inaccurate, but it's trying to, again, write as if a Chinese person was using English, perhaps. I order and phone call my consort, telling her I'm out dining. She says, miss you, and to be honest, I miss the Chinese scripted. Yeah. Noise heavy lane, back end, downstairs, red walled, etc. I tried to introduce a lot of words or phrases that even Koreans might not be aware of. Anbin, for example, being content with poverty. Hwashingpung, a breeze bearing tidings of spring. Sokni, transcending the mundane world. Juson, pleasure-seeking mountain hermits. They're very hard to translate, some of these phrases. This is a Japanese phrase, old barnacle-back sea turtles. So this episode deals with some old folks, passing generation. They're like old sea turtles with barnacles stuck on their shell. Kyunghwa, practice bow and archery. Not the real bow you use in competition, but the one you use in practice. A dormant dragon. a distinguished guest, BB. This is a relatively unknown concept here. Pumsujitan. Your parents have died and you regret not treating them better. Pointless excess. Drawing a snake with feet. It's unnecessary. Going into the unnecessary elements at a tailor shop. Okay, real quick. If you like travel, one episode deals with a train ride, another deals with a bus ride, another deals with a subway ride. It's sort of a descent into the subway, madness invoking. Here's another one that's positive about how alive and vibrant the subway station can be. You can feel very alive there. A feeling of sublimity, a feeling of living in the best of societies. Open your eyes, urge my friend, etc., etc. Skip for the sake of time. I did a lot of pairing. So you see one thing and then you see another. That's the opposite or mere reflection. This, you can't see it here, but forgive me. This is a vignette about seen through the perspective of a child. This one is about the perspective of an adult, an elder's eyes. This one is about bathing. It's a negative experience of the bathhouse, the mokyokan. All the fluids and things mixing, all the bodies. However, balneology too. Balneology is the study of bathing. Maybe you say yokhak. It's no real word. However, in this case, it's a very ecstatic experience. Notice I say then that human sediment is fluid and fills the room. A whale ship solidary prevails. A feeling of fraternity, of convivial masculinity, of nuanced attractions and wholesome curiosity. Like in a barracks or sportsman's locker room, there's a coming together of stripped identities, a doffing of armor that leaves each male vulnerable yet each substantial. That, perhaps you recognize, has elements from Moby Dick. Squeeze of the hand. There's a chapter where Ishmael is squeezing the blubber, the sperm of the sperm whale. And he realized, wow, this is making me feel alive. Squeeze, squeeze all morning long. He's melting into each other, into his mates. Would I could keep squeezing the sperm forever. He loves the experience. Bringing together man and this bonding. All right. Yeah, all right. Last thing, country mouse, town mouse. Talk about the heat, the hottest times of Seoul, even the coldest times of Seoul. Frozen crockery, bingo. All right. Why don't we just get to the end? So it ends with an envoy. Come meet me at Stair Bottom and Cherry Dawn, and I'll walk with you through a city and its seasons. So it ends with the same sentence as it began with. I borrowed that again from Joyce. He likes cycles, seasonal things. Commodious vicus of recirculation. If you've ever read Finnegan's Wake, the first sentence connects with the last sentence. First sentence starts in medias res. There's no beginning. To read the first sentence appropriately, you have to get to the last sentence. Away, alone, alas, the love, the long, the, and then you can turn to the beginning of the book, river run, past even Adams. So the book cycles around. Tried to emulate that a bit. And thus we'll finish with the title page. Thank you. Apologies for going over. Brief questions? By the way, if you saw a book or a quote or something that you liked but didn't take note of, feel free. I can go back and show you. It was sort of fast-paced. Yeah, cool.
A challenge. What book do you give to, say, an American friend or family member who has never been to Korea and knows nothing of Korea, but you're like, this is the book you have to read, other than yours?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't have a go-to answer. The Percival Lau was probably the guy I thought I should revisit him and maybe even read the full texts. Well, he wrote many books, but he might be. Yeah, forgive me. No ready answer. So yeah, I'm trying. Yeah, I kind of see myself a little bit as not making new ground, but at least giving a contestant something worthwhile that people who want to visit Korea should consider reading. I consider it fairly all-encompassing, but yeah. Sorry, no ready answer. Other questions? Oh, yeah. Some of these phrases, the relative. Where did I encounter them? Yeah, honestly, the dictionary. I look up one word in the dictionary, and then I'll sometimes in the Korean dictionary, and then you kind of take a look at the words in the vicinity. In doing so, you encounter a lot of rare, obscure words. So I'll take note of those, save them in a file, and then call on them when needed. Maybe sometimes they inspire a vignette, sometimes they serve a vignette perfectly. But yeah, to be honest, some of those just came up from looking at a similar word. Once you learn the hanja, right, you can kind of, okay, so let's say hua is flower. What other expressions are there that deal with flower? And you find some really incredible stuff. Most of it people don't use anymore, but that's the fun of it. Yeah.
Can you tell us about how you came up with I came across a title called Real Imaginary Gods, which is quite similar to the title.
Yeah. There are a few, strangely, there are a few similar titles, and one of them is about writing, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, on reading and writing.
Yeah, it's a how-to on reading and writing poetry. So Marianne Moore's poem inspired, I imagine, all of these titles, which are just versions of each other in some sense. Mine is sort of the opposite of what she said. But the idea boils down to a dichotomy between real and imaginary, illusion and reality. So when you're living somewhere, especially somewhere that's new to you, there's always a struggle between what you picture and what you want, the preconceived notion and then the reality of it. Or for anyone, really, your own life, negotiating that tension between, let's say, what's the down to earth actuality, and then what do you want to strive towards? So I was trying to invoke that mostly. Yeah. Good question. Thank you. Yeah. 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 So to be honest, a lot of the historical books that I shared are books that I'm only superficially familiar with. I wanted to make this lecture more than just about my book, so I offered that background. So I'm not very familiar with a lot of those texts. Therefore, most of what's in the book is personal experience. And it being a first novel, they always say that one's first novel tends to be about yourself. It tends to be autobiographical or heavy on autobiography. So yeah, these are experiences that I accumulated over the years. First, they were just notes, and then the structure came to me, used the jolgi, the 24 seasonal divisions. Okay, that means I need so many vignettes. You expand on your notes from years ago. That's the process, the writing process I adopted. I'm sorry? Update the bio? Oh, yeah. Yeah, the rooftop, if you read the book, my rooftop is a very important space in one of the central spaces of the book. If you're lucky to have a rooftop or any private space in your house, outdoors, you might find similar inspiration, looking at the stars. I grow a garden there. That's another, yeah, you asked about the meaning of the title. So the garden, I forgot, is very central to the book, by the way. Yeah, that was a humorous self-description, by the way. Yeah.
So this is a novel, it's not a travel.
Yeah, the way I like the Latin phrase sui generis, sort of in its own category. Travelogue, ethnography, short story compilation, and then it all, because they're stringed together, it all works as a novel. I like to say it's a novel. That's sort of the most ennobling title. Yeah.
And my question is, yeah. Among the works that you introduced, you think how much of the historical sense or the historical concept or the historical context is given due reference? So, for example, when you go to a country that smells bad and it's dirt war and a little I mean, like, for example, if you go to a country in the Middle East, that might, to come to that description, whereas it used to be the London and Paris of times of developers.
Yeah.
So this kind of context would, I would feel, sort of help illuminate sort of the context of the place where you visit. Although it smells bad today, that was the Paris of before.
Yeah.
Do you think that actually works that to give inspiration of content? Like someone visiting Korea 20 years ago, you might have noticed a lot of the bad smell, but someone coming today might not be aware that it used to be a place that did smell bad.
Yeah. So first, just to be clear, I didn't share all these views. I wouldn't say it smells bad, but everyone's a product of their time. I think nowadays the modern traveler is probably the most self-aware. Perhaps they've engaged with some of the indirectly even post-colonial ideas, the ideas of yeah, there are places that are poor because of capital and imperialism and their history. Whether there's a specific book that would encapsulate that perspective, I can't point anything.
But we're out of time.
So yeah, I'm happy to talk with anybody afterwards, leisurely. And again, thank you for staying late or staying. Very much appreciated. If you're interested in the book, by all means, purchase. Thank you. See you guys.